Is that Searsucker or Glenn Plaid?
It is the summer uniform of all gentlemen.
There you go. The Charleston tuxedo. Mr. Durrett, how's your meeting going there?
I'm sorry, Gary, what's that?
Well, it looks like you've got all your friends there with you. I wondered how your meeting there is going.
I can't get a word in edgewise.
All right, well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. What do you think, John? We good to start?
We are, and we are almost at a quorum already. So yes.
Okay. Well, great. Well, listen, thank you all for attending the TAQC meeting this morning. I want to welcome you guys, and as chairman of the Atlanta Regional Commission's Transportation Air Quality Committee, I'm going to call this meeting to order at 10:32 a.m. on July 14th, 2021. I welcome the committee and anyone else who's chosen to listen in this morning. We're continuing to meet by video conference and teleconference. The public health state of emergency expired on July 1st, 2021. However, ARC has continued planning for the reopening of the offices, which has not yet occurred. Based on the ARC assessment of safety conditions, we consider these reasons as meeting the emergency conditions necessitated under the open meetings law to hold a virtual meeting. It should also be noted that the governor did issue a state of emergency for economic recovery, which includes certain regulatory suspensions. The Georgia Open Meetings Act says, quote, under circumstances necessitated by emergency conditions involving public safety, we may meet by means of teleconference, end quote. And I'm paraphrasing there. So the public is afforded simultaneous access to this video conference and teleconference meeting. Notice of the link and call-in number have been posted on our website. And as a matter of protocol, if a member speaks during this meeting, makes a motion or seconds, please identify yourself first so the minutes may be accurately recorded. And I also ask that the committee members and presenters please mute yourself and unmute when needing to speak. The meeting is being recorded via Microsoft Teams and will be placed on the ARC website as a link to view once the meeting has concluded. ARC staff is monitoring the attendance as members are joining the meeting, and staff will verbally walk through the members attending before we discuss committee introduced topics. We have two housekeeping items before jumping into the main agenda items. First, staff previously distributed the May 12th TAQC meeting summary. So far, we've not received any edits on the summary. Do we have any edits from the floor? If not, then the meeting summary is accepted as distributed. John, do we have any public comment today?
No, sir. We did not receive requests for public comment.
All right. Well, let's just jump right into the agenda. A lot of major discussions going on right now in the U.S. House and Senate regarding the reauthorization of the FAST Act. And now staff's going to provide us an update on these discussions. John, I think you've got that teed up, ready to go. John Biles.
I do, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, and greetings to everyone. Before I start my remarks, I wanted to mention we have dueling conference calls in our house right now, and I drew the short straw to have the dog in my office. And she is sometimes prone to react enthusiastically to anything that walks by our house. So I'll do my best to contain any outbursts by her and roll through these slides in as efficient manner as possible. So yes, as the chairman mentioned, infrastructure, big topic of conversation. Sure, everybody has been keeping up with bated breath about what is going to happen next. And John Orr and I are going to kind of tag team an overview of kind of where we're at in the mechanics of the legislation itself, and then kind of where we're at as an agency with respect to what we know about the existing language as it's floating around and still being perfected. And I do want to say in advance, none of this should be taken to the bank. There is still a lot of meat left on the bone, so to speak. And I think we have a relatively long way to go before we see a final deal, whether they get conference together, whether there's some sort of ultimate package that's adopted over one or the other. That's still kind of a crystal ball like prediction. So John, with that, you can kind of jump into the slides.
Okay, John, is that yes, here we go.
Here we go. So just to give everybody a brief overview of the current situation. We are discussing infrastructure because the current transportation infrastructure authorization package or funding guidance is operating under a one-year extension. That guidance was called the FAST Act. It was passed several years ago as part of the big negotiated omnibus at the end of last year. We got FAST Act extended for one additional year, and it currently expires on September 30th. Funding levels were, okay. We were happy with the extension. I can't say that was something that we were sad to see move forward, but we are now talking about what comes after the FAST Act, and typically these authorization packages get reauthorized in about 5-year chunks. So early this year, the president introduced the American Jobs Plan. This was a very ambitious plan, had a $2 trillion price tag, and it created the debate that a lot of you have probably heard a bit about between traditional infrastructure and human infrastructure. For the purposes of our discussion here today, let's kind of leave the American Jobs Plan sort of out on the back burner. We're not going to talk a whole lot about that because the two packages we are considering right now concentrate on this idea of traditional infrastructure, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, includes things like roads, bridges, ports, transit, so on and so forth. Right now, where we're at on the House side, the House passed their reauthorization package on July 1st. That's called the INVEST Act, and I'll talk about that in a bit more detail on the next slide. And the Senate is working on a package that is not only the kind of the baseline reauthorization that would be found, say, in the FAST Act and what was authorized through September 30th of this year, but it also includes additional money for some of the American Families Plan suggestions that include, boosted funding for things like EV infrastructure, boosted funding for transit, and we'll talk about that in greater detail in a few slides. And this is the bipartisan, infrastructure framework that you've been hearing about. You've been hearing about a deal. This is the portion of the conversation that involves, the so-called deal. We can go to the next slide, John. Just before we talk about the specifics of each track we're on, I wanted to emphasize some key themes that have been common through the president's recommendations, the House bill and the Senate bill. They've all focused to one extent or another on including more money for transit, including new money for passenger and freight rail programs. They've emphasized diversity, equity, and inclusion in contracting, workforce, hiring, things of that nature. They've certainly focused on transportation, electrification, and climate change. And with President Biden's background in labor and his support from that particular group, it's also been fairly. There's been an emphasis, fairly high emphasis on support for labor. John. So let's talk a little bit about the House package, which is technically the only thing we have actual language for that's been passed by either chamber, better known as HR 3684 or the INVEST Act. This bill passed on July 1st, as I said, by an almost completely partisan line vote, 221 to 201. This is essentially a FAST Act reauthorization bill with increases in our common buckets of funding. So we're looking at about $600 billion over 5 years, and it includes healthy increases for roads, bridges, and other major projects, about $330 billion. It includes a very healthy increase for public transit, $104 billion for public transit, and it includes funding for operations, additional money for passenger and freight rail, and additional money for active transportation infrastructure, which of course is important to our agency because that includes bikes, paths, and trails and things of that nature. There are additional monies made available for MPO planning functions, which John will drill down into a little later. That's all good for us. We always like to see an increase for the primary funding buckets for what we are primarily charged with. And the House package also includes earmarks. 50,000 foot Cliffs Notes version earmarks are separate funding buckets for specific projects. This is the first time they've been around for a while. They've come back. Just one note on the Senate side, there has been no decision made whether to proceed with earmarks, but on the House side, they have taken earmarks into consideration. I'm happy to circulate a list, or John can circulate a list of the earmarks that have been proposed for Georgia. but we are on the list for several of them, specific to the ARC region and specific to the state as a whole. How to pay for it? Of course, this is always the big question with these things. The pay fors have yet to be determined, other than a small $180 billion that has been made available from the general fund to support the Highway Trust Fund. I think those of you that have heard me present before on federal issues, one of the things I tend to emphasize when it comes to federal funding authorizations is the Highway Trust Fund is insolvent. We need to find another way to fund it. And hopefully they will come up with some clever ways to fund the entire $600 billion that is included in this package in a way that not only reinforces the Highway Trust Fund, but also expands revenue options, whether that be vehicle miles traveled or some other mechanism. So we have some funding security going into the future, because right now it's a little fuzzy, not to use a George Bush quote, but it's a little fuzzy on how we do the math and how we get to the 574 billion there in that third bullet. John?
Sorry, John, there's a little bit of a pause on it.
No problem.
John, my system has frozen up here for a moment. There it is.
Okay. Okay, so technical problems aside, moving on to the Senate side of things. Remember, I said the Senate package currently includes our standard baseline reauthorization plus infrastructure. So the full package itself is worth about $975 billion. It's yet to be determined whether this funding will be spread out over 5 to 8 years. It includes traditional authorization funding plus an additional $579 billion in new spending. So we're looking at this package. It's, the baseline funding for reauthorization is about the same as the House package, but it also includes this extra $579 billion for things that we'll talk about here in a second. Much of the language for this deal still needs to be written. Again, you've heard a lot about the deal. It's a small bipartisan group of senators that have come to an agreement on kind of the framework of what it should look like. The language for this particular deal is yet to be written, but key categories of funding that we know about that comprise the new spending are, of course, very important to us. It would include, on top of the baseline funding, an additional $125 billion for roads, bridges, ports, and waterways, specifically $109 billion for roads and bridges, an additional $66 billion over baseline funding for passenger and freight rail, an additional $49 billion for public transit, so on and so forth. We're certainly, as an agency, happy to see an additional buy-in for supporting, infrastructure and things that are, of course, important to us. But I do want to stress to everybody on this call, one of the reasons I'm not going into a lot of detail about what this package specifically looks like, because we don't know what the final language is going to look like, and we don't know how this final package on the Senate side will actually take shape. There's still a long way to go, and we'll talk about how we will be engaging all of you in the coming weeks in a few slides. Next steps. So the Senate staff are working on the language, as I just explained, the bipartisan infrastructure framework, burning the midnight oil to get that done. The Senate will also work to maintain the fragile deal that they have. There are two or three senators on the Democratic side that are, have a potential to waffle if the deal falls apart. That would be Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema. And we also have, a contingent on the farther left of the political spectrum that may not want to work out a deal because their particular issues have not made it into the package as it stands now. So we will wait to see how all of this plays out. It is important to note that the Senate Environment and Public Works and Commerce Committees have already written their smaller titles for the regular baseline increases that would be commensurate with FAST Act funding that is getting replaced. So we do have some kind of placeholders if the deal would fall apart for some baseline funding that would look, again, very similar to what we've got in the House right now. But as always, on the Senate side too, there is very little guidance on how to pay for these bills. But the current cost of borrowing is low, so we may see some deficit spending funding for this sort of thing as well. I also want to mention, and we'll go back to the American Jobs Plan for just a second. That was the larger $2 trillion package that the president introduced earlier in the year. Whatever doesn't make it into this deal you're likely to see a large chunk of what doesn't make it into the deal that was originally in the president's plan taken care of in reconciliation, and that's a budget mechanism that's used at the end of the year, where they will load up the budget with a lot of things that the president recommended that didn't make it into this infrastructure deal. I do not know how that will play out. Those of you that have been paying attention to the headlines in the last 24 hours, you may have likely seen headlines that said something like reconciliation deal close, or Democrats come to deal on reconciliation for things that weren't in this infrastructure deal. I wouldn't take a lot of that to the bank yet. I would simply tell everyone to make note that they're making progress on what reconciliation may look like, but that is certainly not going to take place until much later in the year. And we will know much more as this all unfolds. The process for the infrastructure deal is likely to last through the summer. And of course, it'll get combined with regular appropriations processes later in the year. The debt ceiling increase, of course, will come up again at the end of the year. So, again, I emphasize we've got a long way to go before a final package is kind of agreed on and kind of the mechanisms that'll be used to pass it. I do want to emphasize that we will continue to brief members of this committee on the proposals as they develop. And we're, of course, working, overtime with members of Congress, not only our Georgia delegation, but members on committees of jurisdiction that we have relationships with, to get our input in on a few of the things that John is going to talk about specifically. And, I want to emphasize right now that not only are we working internally to bolster the packages as they stand now, and to get to the finish line with as advantageous a position as possible for the ARC. We will likely come to board members in an ad hoc basis to help us with communications to members of Congress as well. I don't have a specific plan on what that'll look like or when we will pull that trigger, but I did want to put everybody on notice that's here, representing the ARC board, that we will in all likelihood be reaching out to you at some juncture down the road for some assistance with members of Congress. John?
Thank you, John. And I'll cover a couple of items relatively quickly. Is that I did want to do a little bit of a deep dive into, as John noted, the bill that passed the House of Representatives, referred to as the Invest in America Act, because we wanted to see how this aligns with some of the reauthorization principles we all discussed back in March. And just to make sure everyone is aware, after these were developed, those reauthorization principles, the Metro Atlanta Chamber also signed on to help support those as well. And then back in March, John shared this information with our congressional delegation on our principles. And to see how these align with some of our principles, we did look at first of all, we wanted to make sure to see how the funding is aligning. And I know this is a very busy slide, but ultimately what it does is by project categories and programs, it compares the spending to a baseline, which is basically our current funding levels as the nation. And I should note these are in billions, these numbers. And then in the third column, you can see the bipartisan framework that John discussed. And then in the last column, the House bill that did get out of the House of Representatives for reauthorization. And I did want to just note a couple of points on this. Obviously the funding is increasing significantly. But the first item I wanted to draw your attention to is the first major category, roads, bridges, major projects. Currently, we're spending about $250 billion in the current bill. And then you ultimately look at the spending in the bipartisan framework, significant over $100 billion increase. And then also you can see some a little bit smaller increase in the House. One of the items that jumps out as well is going to be the third row, which is going to be public transit under that category. Significant increases in public transit, and this would include everything from formula funding to our local transit systems to also potential discretionary programs for major capital projects. Passenger rail is a major, I think, beneficiary of both plans, with a large amount of this going to Amtrak for them to construct potentially new routes and also upgrade the Northeast corridor between Washington and Boston. And then finally, this is very important. It's going to be these the EV electric vehicle infrastructure, low carbon emission buses, reconnecting communities, and then resiliency. Currently, these would be, we do not have programs specifically addressing these. And in both the bipartisan framework in the Senate and the House, these would be major new programs. This, I think, is absolutely, we're going to see these programs come in reauthorization. We don't know what levels. These numbers, like John was pointing out, are very fluid. But nevertheless, this could be a historic investment in really transportation in this next reauthorization bill. Very, very huge increases. Now, with some of the reauthorization principles for the FAST Act that we previously discussed, I wanted to walk through just a couple of these. First item, of course, we wanted to make sure that we are able to have the resources we need for MPOs around the country to continue to do the planning work necessary for us to implement federal aid projects. And in the House bill, it's a major increase. It would be about 41%. But with all good things, there does come challenges. Is that one thing we've also been hoping would happen would be a change in the match requirements from 80% federal, 20% non-federal to 90% federal and 10% non-federal. This is an item I think that would, if it were to be included in the bill, it would absolutely help ARC and our financial capacity to be able to make sure that we're able to not have to leave funds on the table with the potential we may not have enough non-federal match to be able to draw down every penny. So this is an item I'm sure that John will be discussing with policymakers about how we can continue to advocate or at least support that provision. And this is important to a lot of our peer MPOs around the country as well.
Discussing would be an understatement, John.
Absolutely. And John, is there anything you wanted to add on to that?
Just that, you know, this is a really, really important caveat. And, you know, we've been working extremely hard on this now for months, and we were, you know, a little disappointed to see it not advanced to this stage, but there are still, you know, plenty of days left before this final package is done. And we've been pretty adamant about the need for this to be in there. We're working with our counterpart agencies across the country on this, with trade associations that we're members of. So this is not an issue that is singular to ARC's, you know, docket of things that would, you know, we'd like to see in the final package. This is pretty important to everyone in our you know, regional council or regional commission community. So, you know, rest assured that this is something that is pretty much the number one priority for us. And I also wanted to just mention, I coincidentally have to give this exact same presentation to the Georgia Transit Association in about 6 minutes. So if you see me jump off, that is why. If for some reason we don't get to a Q&A and you all had any questions for me personally, feel free to reach out to me via email or via cell. My information is on the last slide here, but I think most of you have it.
Thank you, John. I'll pick it up a little bit. So if anyone has discussions, maybe John, we can tackle those before you have to get off. But one important item is that, of course, we wanted to make sure that we were able to have resources coming into ARC to be identified as what's called a high-performing MPO. And the bill does establish what's called a new Metro Performance Program. It's about 250 annually. And if we were selected as one of the MPOs, it would mean we would have about another at least $10 million a year that we could allocate through TAQC, and possibly up to $50 million per year. It would be a huge benefit. We could all collectively through TAQC do a lot of good things in the region with that additional funding. There's a little bit of devil in the details on it that we're still trying to understand. If we so chose, you could, if local government, MPO, clear the project with FHWA, but through the environmental process. But there's a lot of, I think, pitfalls we see to that aspect. But we could continue to work with GDOT to implement projects as part of the environmental process. One item on this I did want to note that we are pleased about is that a lot of TAQC's funding that we get for the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, well, it's set based on population. And one thing that the bill proposes to do is increase that from 55% to 60%. But it did not restore it back to 62.5%, which is what that level was about 10 years ago. So that's an item we still want to work on. And a couple of other provisions that we had, and these are, like I indicated, long-standing ARC provisions going back years, would be to absolutely retain within the CMAQ and Transportation Alternatives Program funding that where it could not be directed to other programs. That would basically double the amount of CMAQ and Transportation Alternatives funding that is in the House bill. An item, and I'll just cover this first one on top, absolutely critical for our region, which is the FTA Capital Investment Grants Program, which our communities are going to need to be able to get federal funds to expand transit and other sources. And this would increase those program funds from about $2.3 billion per year to $3.5 billion. So a major increase nationally for that. And then finally, without going through each and every one of these, I did want to highlight two. The first one is a little bit of inside baseball, probably to many of you, but as John noted, the Highway Trust Fund is not in good shape. It continues to need injections from the federal general fund. And so one of the things that ARC's supported for a long time is the federal government allowing states to do pilot VMT programs, vehicle miles traveled, because we know over time revenues coming in from people filling up their gas tanks are going to go down, both to improve fuel economy and electrification as well. So that's an item that we think is very, very positive. And then finally, the second item is also important, is that there's a provision in the Senate discussion bill about requiring NEPA to be completed in roughly 2 years, or at least getting that process streamlined. And that's not in the House bill, so that's another for. So maybe you close it out, Chairman Matthews. I think that we're getting to the process, as John noted, where we probably want to have some discussions with everyone as policymakers, because there may be some important things the region still needs to have put in these bills that's not there now, everything from match requirements and other items. So there'll be more to come on this, and we'll continue to discuss this at the TAQC Policy Committee. We're going to meet on July 30th, so more to come on this. But we'd love to get any feedback from the group. Chairman Matthews, any thoughts anyone has?
All right, thank you, John. And John, appreciate that. Any questions or comments from the committee? Come on, don't be shy. There's a lot of information. Good stuff.
I think it was a great presentation, full of information, clearly delivered. so thank you guys for working on it.
Definitely.
Appreciate the compliment. Thank you.
And I agree. My question, I guess, would be on the vehicle miles traveled tax mode. How do you overcome, how do you measure that? I mean, do you file that on your income tax every year, show how many miles you drove? Are there monitoring devices? How do you ascertain that on an individual basis?
A great question. And the short story on it is that there have been some states that have tried to pilot that, like Oregon, Kentucky, small pilots. And there are different ways you can do this while respecting the privacy of drivers, which I know a lot of people are worried around the country about, like people, Big Brother knowing everywhere you're going when. But ultimately, it does involve like kind of a mileage report that goes in that you pay annually to the state, your taxes versus every time you fill up. But we'll be glad to get a little bit more follow up on that and give you some more details because this is going to be an item we'll be discussing moving forward.
Yeah. All right, anybody else?
I'd like to just chime in one thing, Rusty. There are a lot, I mean, technology has come a long way in terms of how to track VMT. From what I'm hearing from technology companies is we think we got to figure it out, but we're not going to spend any more money or time on it until Washington figures out that's the direction we're going to go because it's a big lift. But I think once it's clear they're headed that direction, there will be technology solutions, you know, not unlike Peach Pass and all of those things that are nearly readily available.
I know it's just going to run into problems with the civil libertarians. We buy cell phone data. I mean, when we do origination and destination studies, your cell phone measures where you are at all times, whether you know it or not.
Yeah.
And that data aggregated is readily available to anybody who wants to pay for it. And we use it to, it's much better than putting those little meters across the street. It's much more accurate because we know when you leave and we know where you arrive and which route you took. So, so that's going to be the issue, I think, on that one is civil libertarians. How are you going to protect people's individual privacy? And that's going to create a battle royal when it comes down to it.
Yeah, probably will. That, by the way, is why I turn my phone off when I drive through Sandy Springs, but that's another topic.
We have other ways to get you, buddy.
Good discussion. Any other questions or comments? I know John's got to get to another presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman.
Yep, John, thank you. Appreciate it. Keep us updated and let us know what's going on.
Certainly will. Everyone have a quorum. Bye-bye.
Thank you, you too. All right, we're moving into some action items. John, are we good with a quorum?
We are, and maybe I could do just a quick attendance check. Would that be okay, Chairman?
Absolutely.
Okay, and Becky Apter's also been checking, and Becky, let me know if I've missed anyone. Chairman, and these are the persons I have in attendance right now. Chairman Mark Matthews, Vice Chairman Mayor Mike Mason, ARC Chair Carrie Armstrong, Mayor Eric Clarkson, Chairwoman Lisa Cupid, Tread Davis with DCA, Mayor Vince Evans, Tamara Hayes with EPD, Chairman Lee Hearn, Chairwoman Nicole Hendrickson, Chairman Harry Johnston, Ms. Levitan, Chairwoman Cindy Mills, Mayor Rusty Paul, Jim Durrett from MARTA, Chairman Vince Williams, and Becky, and also Chairwoman Carlotta Harrell. Did I miss anyone?
Yes, Chairman Ramona Jackson Jones. Mm-hmm.
Oh, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else?
That matches my list, John.
Very good. So we do have a quorum, Chairman Matthews.
Okay, fantastic. All right, well then for our first action item today, ARC and regional partners have worked to develop a menu of local and regional tactics that will work in coordinated manner to improve mobility in the Atlanta region. ARC staff is going to highlight the main recommendations from the study, which focus on complementary paratransit, ADA, and county-run demand response transportation. The first read of this was held on the action item at the May TCC, TAQC, and ARC board meetings. Sydney Dowse is going to give us a brief presentation today and remind us of the recommendations in the plan and for our action. Sydney?
Good morning.
Good morning.
Data Sydney Dowse of ARC. You saw this a few months ago, and I will take you through a brief refresher on this plan. How's my audio on my screen?
Very good.
All right, thank you. Okay. Quick background, the Coordinated Human Services Transportation Plan, which is required by the FTA, was completed in 2017, in particular in order to receive 5310 funding. Out of that plan came the recommendation to do this plan, which, building on the previous effort, wanted to focus more specifically on complementary paratransit and various county-run demand response transportation systems and programs. And that is what prompted this study. We started in November. And out of that study came the following key recommendations: establish consistent ADA eligibility and rider policies, better coordinate those ADA transfers, integrate DRT, which is demand response transportation, into regional trip planning. Some of that effort has already started with some of the programs that ARC and the ATL are conducting now, in particular between CPACs and Gwinnett County Transportation. Regionally coordinate microtransit services. So there are various microtransit pilots and tests that have taken place around the region. The recommendation is to coordinate these at a regional level so that everybody can learn from the different efforts. And importantly, how to sustain regional coordination and collaboration on human services transportation, particularly the technical advisory group that we set up for this study. How can we continue to meet and move forward without creating too much of a duplication of efforts, meetings, and committees? And finally, there were some additional strategy primers as stated in the plan. These were issues that were important, but we did not get into a lot of detail in this plan. And these are some of the things that we will probably look at in the HST update that we hope to do next year. But those were the 5310 funding program. A lot of operators needed assistance in understanding the program, how to apply for funds, and some of the rules and regulations. Fair payment, how to integrate some of the fair payment changes, such as what the ATL is working on a regional scale, to work with HST. Volunteer driver programs, non-emergency medical transportation brokerage, planning for post-2020 census, transit network companies such as Uber and Lyft, how to work with those booking assistance programs, such as those that are currently being run by Fulton County Senior Services, and commingling riders, meaning could there be a trip where there is a HST trip that is not ADA required, or could be ADA required, that is in the same path as a regular trip, maybe through a microtransit service, where both of those riders could ride together instead of two separate systems going to the same place. We're looking at that as well, and we're also kind of studying that locally too. So those are the primers. Next steps is we hope to adopt this plan this month. In the summer, fall of this year, we're going to reestablish the group to get the regional coordination going, and we're going to update the federally required HST plan next year with a heavy focus on a lot of the demand response principles that were studied in this plan. Now, with that, I'll take any questions.
Thank you for that. Any questions or comments from the committee? All right, hearing none, could I get a motion to approve this plan?
Jim Durrett will move approval.
All right, I have a motion to approve. Can I get a second?
Rusty Paul will second.
Thank you, Rusty. Any discussion at all? If not, please unmute and vote by saying aye. Any in favor? All in favor, please say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? All right, that motion carries. Thank you very much. It's unanimous. Moving
Thank
into the next item is the regional transit safety performance measures and targets. This is also an action item. As part of the federal transportation planning requirements, transit operators and MPOs such as ARC are required to develop transit safety targets. Examples of these targets include the number of reportable injuries and the rate per total vehicle revenue miles, and also mechanical failures. ARC staff has worked with regional transit operators and will present information on the draft targets. The first read of this was held on the action item back in May at TCC, TAQC, and the ARC board. And Sydney's going to give us a presentation on this as well and remind us of the recommendations that are found in this plan so that we can give that consideration for adoption as well. Sydney?
Thank you. Is my screen okay?
Yes.
All right, thank you. Yes, so these are the regional transit safety performance targets that I presented to you as well in May. Quick background also, back in July of 2018, FTA established the Public Transportation Agency Safety Plan final rule that sort of got things rolling, requiring transit providers and operators to develop certified agency plans, including 4 targets that will serve as safety performance measures. Last July, all of the operators were required to have their agency plans certified and in place, meaning adopted by their boards, and those targets were required to be shared with the state and with the NPO. And that is when we started to collect the safety plans for the operators within our region. And July of this year, the NPO must adopt regional safety targets based on those targets set by the operators in the region. The 4 performance targets that are included in the operator plans and we must set regional targets for are fatalities, injuries, safety events, and system reliability. Fatalities, injuries, and safety events, we're required to look at the total number and set a target for the total number and look at the rate of each of those measures per total vehicle revenue miles by the different modes. And then system reliability is measured by the mean distance between what FDA calls major mechanical failures by mode as well. So in order to set those targets, as I stated, we started collecting the operator plans within the region. We had 2 meetings with the transit operators group, and we had some internal meetings with ARC staff. And primarily because this is actually the first year for these transit safety targets, our proposal for this year is to set them sort of easily at taking the highest numbers and highest rates around the region, basically to allow all of the operators to fit and sort of comply with the targets for 2021 and to allow us time to work for next year, because this does have to happen on an annual basis. to continue to work with the TOG, Transit Operators Group, to establish and improve the methodology, collect more historical data as these operator plans are complete, analyze the transit route changes after COVID, work in particular with our performance analytics and monitoring group, as well as staff at other regional transit agencies on setting these targets, and also to collaborate with some of the other NPOs that have just started to set these targets as well, to share information and ideas to improve these targets going forward. And in particular, we need to find the best way to weigh and average the large versus the small operators within our region. So for this year, these are the actual targets. I won't go into every number, but some of the big takeaways are that for fatalities, obviously everybody has the target and the proposal for having a number and rate of 0 for the year. You see more variation in the injuries. And one note, the rate varies a lot for some of the different modes and the numbers in particular. FTA allows the most operators to set this rate per 100,000 vehicle road miles, but larger operators are set at 10 million vehicle road miles. This is where I refer to finding a better way to weight and average the difference between the operators. That is the same for safety events, and you can see system reliability shown here as well. Large variation in the various numbers, but one other key, MARTA is the only system with light rail and heavy rail, so it heavily relies on their reporting for that, and then a lot more operators report for obviously fixed route bus, demand response, and commuter bus. So these are the targets that we have set for this year. As I stated in the previous slide, we're going to work towards improving this methodology going forward, but we wanted to keep it simple for the first year. And our next step is that we hope to adopt this in July, actually today. And after adoption, we're going to move forward working towards setting a new type of methodology that is more specific and more custom for our region. And with that, I'll take any questions.
All right, thank you for that. Any questions or comments? I know we've talked about this in the past, and there have been some questions raised on these numbers, and I know we're continuing to work with some of those groups to see if we can get something that is a little more palatable, I think, for everybody. So, any questions from any of the committee members?
One question, how do we are we comparing to other MPOs and see if our standards are within the zone of what they're experiencing?
And now I can take a first crack at that, Sydney, is that done, and then weigh in with any other info you may want to share too. But actually, our transit operators in the Atlanta region are MARTA, some of the others have very safe relative systems compared to a lot of their peers, certainly in the country. And as an item that I know over the years, we've been pretty proud of.
Thank you.
And to quickly add, we have looked at some peer MPOs, Washington, D.C. in particular. Honestly, in true planner fashion, a lot of this information and how it's set up was based on collaborating with our partners, but we watched them, they're in similar size, and a lot of their numbers and methodology ended up being the same. And I'm really thinking of that MPO and others to really talk with moving forward to see how we go forward next year and the years afterwards.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? All right, hearing none, I'm looking for a motion to approve the resolution that's in your packet. It's a resolution supporting the regional public transportation safety targets. Can I get a motion, please?
So moved.
All right, have a motion. Can I get a second?
Jim Durrett will second.
Thank you for that. Any other discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, that's unanimous approval. Thank you guys very much. Appreciate it. Thanks for the information, Sydney. Next up is discussion on project evaluation procedures. This item is going to continue the discussions from the May meeting and will include a discussion on weights for project evaluation metrics. John's going to give some background on this item before turning it over to Tejas. I hope I said that name correctly.
Well, thank you, Chairman Matthews. And did want to just, before continuing the discussion, is like I wanted to always, anytime we discuss technically oriented topics, just alert you that normally we don't get into a lot of the weeds of technical evaluation procedures, but we did want to at least orient everyone about how we evaluate projects, and then we'll work through the details with our Transportation Coordinating Committee and the TAQC Policy Subcommittee. But where this is important is that we're very fortunate in Metro Atlanta that we have a lot of consensus on how we evaluate, score projects, because, and as the staff gives you recommendations as the policymaking committee, we want you all to have an understanding about generally how we get to that. So Tejas is going to give you a little bit of a background on this. And then one thing we'll be doing is following up with a little bit of a fun survey to get your thoughts on how we evaluate projects. So I'll turn it over to you, Tejas.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm Tejas Kotak. I'm going to talk about our TIP project prioritization process and some updates we have planned for the next round of it. First of all, I want to go through what we call our Key Decision Point Framework, or our KDP framework. This is a framework that we developed back in 2015, 2016, and we have used for the last two TIP solicitations in 2017 and 2019, and we plan on using in the next one as well, that will open later this year or sometime early next. So the first step is our Universal TIP project call. This is where we open up our project portal for cities, counties, CIDs, and our state and regional governments to submit projects to us. Then they start going through our various KDP framework. There's KDP 1, which is our policy filters. This is a step where it's somewhat of an administrative step. We make sure that the projects check off all the boxes in terms of answering all the questions we have for it, making sure it's from an eligible government, and making sure that it, at a very high level, hits all of our regional policy criteria and regional policy goals. KDP 2 is our technical project evaluation step, and that's something we're going to get into a bit more today. This is a step where we score and rank projects against each other, and it's important to note that we score like projects against like projects. So multi-use trails are compared to other multi-use trails, roadway expansions against other roadway expansions. Then we have KDP 3, which is our final factors. This is a step where senior staff take into account the project scores that we have, but also somewhat more nebulous areas for the project, such as making sure there is regional and social equity that is properly adhered to and properly considered. And we make sure that there is certain aspects of project deliverability and projects are spread equitably across the region. And then we go into our funding decisions for STB/GT, CMAQ, and our TAP programs. That is our Surface Transportation Block Grant, which is a relatively flexible amount of money that we have discretion over. The Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality bucket, which is geared towards projects that help to address and reduce or mitigate transportation-related emissions, and our Transportation Alternatives program, which we gear primarily towards multi-use trails or bicycle and pedestrian programs. So we gave a similar presentation to the TCC last week, and these are some impressions that we got of what they think of our current TIP evaluation process. So a lot of them felt that it was transparent, that it was thorough, comprehensive, data-driven, and very detailed. These are things that we have been working towards for the past decade or so, and we were very happy that our TCC members felt the same way. We also got comments that it was complicated, unbalanced, that it was perhaps too car-focused. Where's the transit was one comment. And that more breakdown was needed at some level in terms of either explanation of the process or breakdown in terms of how we score the projects. So all across the spectrum comments, and we're hoping that we can improve on these positive comments through this update and better address the more critical or negative comments. And here's what the current scoring methodology looks like. We have these 12 different criteria that you can see on the left side of this slide. These are criteria that we came up with in 2015 and 2016 that we believed encompass the whole of project scoring, transportation planning, and address a lot of the key things that we want to do as a region and as an MPO. And depending on the exact project type we are evaluating, we use either 7 of these or 10 of these to ultimately score and rank the projects. What we can see on this slide is that because we're trying to have so many different criteria, all of these percentages are cut up into pretty small percentages. So we have some that range from the mid-20s and some that are closer to 7 to 8%. I want to pause here, see if there are any larger questions on this slide, or just give you a moment to absorb all these numbers.
Any questions? I don't hear any.
Just, it strikes me that mobility and congestion is a relatively small part of this evaluation.
As a singular category, yes, it does come out as a relatively small area. We have other categories here that also address similar ideas to mobility and congestion, such as employment access and goods movement and network connectivity. So all of those together do address the ideas of mobility, congestion, as well as access.
And one thing I'll also share too is like Mr. Davis, like some of the other categories have elements of congestion associated with them, like reliability, and even also on top of that, some of the safety metrics have an indirect relationship at times with congestion too. But yeah, okay. All right.
Question here. I would echo Tred's comments that, you know, it seems like that's first and foremost, and really should get the overwhelming majority of the weight. You know, maybe all those categories could be summed up and put into a single category that that may have subdivisions if you wish, but that focus on the fact that addressing mobility and congestion is really the ultimate point of all this.
Thank you for those comments, and that brings us to what a re-envisioning of this could be. So instead of having the 7 to 10 different criteria, every project type can be scored by these 4 main buckets of mobility and access, equity, safety, and resiliency. Mobility and access will consider a few different things. One is how quickly can people move down this corridor? How many people does it serve? And does it connect people to homes, jobs, and destinations? Equity would consider where a project is physically located, and especially if it is within an area with historically underserved population, and it will consider if the project benefits those people. Safety is whether or not the project will help us reduce the number of transportation-related deaths and serious injuries in the region. And resiliency will consider, will this project reduce transportation-related emissions, greenhouse gases, address stormwater management, and for certain projects, if it helps us maintain a state of good repair within the region. A big question for this is, what should these projects weights be per project type? And that is what the survey we will send you later on, that will help us address that, and you will be able to engage and give us your feedback on that. Now, what would the current scores look like if we simply translated them into these 4 buckets? They would look like this. So if we took what we currently score on and translated them into these 4 buckets, we do see that mobility and access is heavily weighted for most of our project types. Equity and safety are far lower, and resiliency does decently well for most of our project categories. As was commented on, mobility and access and mobility and congestion have long been our main goals as a planning region to address those through our transportation projects. This has been a primary goal of American transportation planning for the past 60 or 70 years, and that is why it is so heavily weighted. And because we have so heavily weighted it for these past several decades, we have a lot of very good quantitative and numerical tools and methodologies to score it. So we have a lot of ways to score mobility and access, equity, safety, and resiliency. We are starting to get very good methods on these, and we should try and hammer those down and get better numerical scores and rankings, but it's still relatively new compared to the more traditional mobility and access. So a big question for this group and for TCC is, do these values are what we had back in 2016. Do they still reflect what our 2021 values are? Should mobility and access be weighted to 50 to almost 67% for these categories, or should we redistribute some of the weight? That is an open question, and we hope that we can engage you and have that discussion and get some valuable feedback from you.
Tejas, Harry Johnston here again. For one, you seem to be a mind reader. Thank you for that. Second, can you, for the ignorant among us, help me understand the difference between roadway asset and roadway EXP TSMO? Yes, of course. Roadway asset means roadway asset management. That is primarily state of good repair and maintenance, so repaving our roads and replacing or repairing our bridges. Roadway expansion, that is adding capacity to our roads either by adding a brand new road, extending a currently existing one, or adding lanes. And then there is roadway TSMO, our transportation systems management and operations projects. There are 2 different buckets that could fall into. One is upgrades or changes to our intersections. So diverging diamond interchanges, adding a roundabout, or continuous left turn lanes. We also see more technology-based TSMO projects that are related to smart signals or adding fiber to your signals so that you can connect them to a central command center, and more emerging technologies such as autonomous and connected vehicles. Thank you.
And Tejas, one of the things we'll do is like we'll when we update some of the slides and such, we'll spell out some of the acronyms for everybody. We try to catch all these, but we will miss them periodically. So thanks for the question.
And that is very related to this next slide of spelling out all of the different project types. And these are the project types that we are going to, for each of them, ask your opinion on what should the weights be. So we have our bicycle and pedestrian projects. These are primarily our bike lanes or cycle tracks and our sidewalks, our multi-use trails, which are primarily our off-road trails that help connect our region for both travel and recreation. So the Atlanta Beltline, the upcoming Chattahoochee Greenway project, and of course our very long and very great Silver Comet Trail. Roadway asset management and expansion I have gone through. A new thing for this next tip solicitation is that our roadway TISMO projects used to be combined into a single category. We are going to split them up into those that are more technology focused and those that are more focused on the built environment. So the built environment ones are, again, the ones that physically change the environment, especially at an intersection. So the diverging diamond interchanges, the roundabouts, and continuous left turn lanes, or some other intersection or interchange reconfiguration. We have transit asset management, which is replacing our rolling stock of buses and potentially trains, or repairs or upgrades to transit facilities that repair and maintain our vehicle fleet. And transit expansion, adding or upgrading new routes. So these are our project types. And a preview of what TCC gave to us. So after our discussion with TCC, we had a live survey with them. And for roadway expansion, this is what they suggested for us. That safety and mobility and access should rank pretty highly. Resiliency and equity are lower, but still higher than what we give them now. And similarly, what TCC gave us for transit expansion projects. Mobility and access ranks very highly, but so do equity and safety. Resiliency is farther down, but still a relatively healthy amount. And our next steps. So we hope to have further discussion with this subcommittee, potentially today or at our next meeting. Continue our discussion with TCC, both the full group and if there are any specific interested stakeholders or subject matter experts as we drill down into this more. And once we have more information on what the potential weights could be and what we are doing under the hood to update our processes and our evaluation metrics, follow up with you and make sure that you are fully informed on what we are doing. So that is my presentation, and I'm open for questions and comments.
Thank you for that. Any questions or comments? Anyone?
Chairman Matthews, well, if anyone's going to get a question, I was just going to interject this. It's like, hey, we realize that, you know, a lot of this can be very technically oriented, but it's been a while since we've spoken with you as policymakers about project weighting. Back with the prior Transportation Air Quality Committee subcommittee, which is now our policy subcommittee, we discussed it a lot. So we wanted just to kind of lay the groundwork for a future discussion today. And because this is an item, we want you all to have confidence and understand when we provide you staff recommendations for tip solicitations and such, you all have a good understanding and have been able to weigh in on how we evaluate projects. So more to come on this, and we look forward to continuing the discussion.
Sounds good. Any questions or comments before we move on? All right, well, that brings us to our next agenda item, which is just other staff items. And John, I think you've got a couple things you wanted to throw out for us here real quick.
Yes, sir. Two items just wanted to alert everyone to is like had previously sent out an email or two about that we have a freight cluster plans funding application cycle open now. That'll be closing on Fridays, so we made sure that all the staffs in the region are aware of it. So I just wanted to give that reminder This program is a funding program where that we study air freight, goods movement, warehousing, distribution areas around the region, provide some federal assistance for that, that for locally sponsored studies. Been a great program so far, so just wanted to remind everybody of that. And then second item is that as we closed out the FY21 fiscal year, which ended June 30th, it became pretty clear that we are going to have some LCI, Livable Centers Initiative funding available in FY22, which is the current fiscal year we're in now. And one thing we wanted to open up is a solicitation for preliminary engineering phases for projects to try to get that funding allocated. We're still working through some of the numbers, but we think we've got about $10 million of funding that we could use for LCI in the LCI program that could go to needed projects. And so we'll be, I'll also work with Amy and we'll follow up more on this with everyone. So we do have that currently open now. So if there's any questions on either one of those, Chairman Matthews, I'll be glad to tackle that.
Sounds good. Any questions? All right, moving right along. Other committee introduced items. Is there anything for the good of the order here from the group? Anyone have anything? It's quiet today. All right, any announcements? John, did you have any announcements?
Just one is that the Transportation TAQC Policy Subcommittee, we do have a meeting scheduled, remote meeting for July the 30th at 10:30. And hopefully all the subcommittee members got a notice on that. I realize that if you do have a conflict, just let me know and I'll be glad to work with you individually to get you briefed up on the items that we plan on discussing, which will be reauthorization. Also, we want to talk a little bit more about this next tip solicitation and some of the info that Paige just shared today on project evaluation procedures. So a lot of good work getting ready to begin and looking forward to that meeting. Thank you.
Sounds good. Any other business?
Yeah, John, I do not have that meeting on my calendar. If I'm still on the policy subcommittee, if you could resend to me, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well done, Mark.
All right, thanks. Any other business? Hearing none, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you all for being here. Don't forget to clean up the trash that you've left in front of your space there and make a quick run through the buffet. Head off to the governance committee. Y'all have a good day. We're adjourned.
Thank you all.